Hey folks, this is Andy with the Poor Proles Almanac. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy our content, you can support us on Venmo and Patreon, where we have a series of unreleased episodes called The Prologues, as well as extended clips from our interview series, if you want to go check those out. Today we're talking with Mark Wardle, the former head ranger on the Slindon estate. We talk a bit about what it means to rewild the landscape and the role of humans in that process, as well as what that means for climate change and the future of humanity. We have a really great conversation where we talk about some really complex stuff, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. As always, if you enjoy it, please give us a review on iTunes. So let's jump right in. Hi Mark, thanks so much for taking some time to talk a little bit about your work. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
I'm told I'm an ecologist. I didn't train as that. I trained in countryside management and rural resource management. There's a mouthful for you. I've been in the game in the UK countryside over 30 plus years now. In fact, nearly 35. I think too hard about it. And during that time, I was lucky enough to be pretty much in one place or one area to see changes take place consistently as a result of my impact, but also natural impacts and other man-made impacts too. And after 25 plus years of managing the same estate, a few things took place that just made me decide it was time to set myself up and go solo and be my own boss instead of have one that wasn't happy with me.
Yeah, so could you talk a little bit about those changes that you did see?
Well, I'm lucky. I'm lucky because in the southeast of the UK and the south of the UK in 1987, one night in October, there was an immense storm, immense by our standards at least, perhaps not by stateside or other climates. But we had over 100 mile an hour winds. Luckily, it was at night and it was a normal sort of autumn. I say normal because we're talking 30 plus years ago, so there's still a bit of leaf on the tree. And trees were blown down left, right and centre all over the place, absolutely everywhere, all shapes and sizes, chaos for some time. Some people took a week to clear roads to get out of their properties. We didn't know how to deal with such a thing. And a lot of the wood was cleared up very, very quickly, far too much in some respects. But what I saw was nature's response to a natural process, that being wind. And what I was lucky enough to see, as well as the catastrophic shock of that kind of natural impact, is the natural regeneration that's taken place since, and habitats have modified and nature's adapted without our impact. It's got on with it quite happily.
I imagine I read one of the articles about that storm, and there was a lot of discussion about the rebirth of the I guess the woodlands floor and a lot of the species that, it reminded me a lot of like the coppicing process of, you have this dense thicket essentially, and then you go through, whatever it is, 5-10 years, clear a section, and then all this life comes back from the earth that has otherwise, you wouldn't think that seed bank or those rhizomes are still alive, and then they just shoot back up. And this seems kind of like the natural version of that.
Yeah, it is. It was. You're absolutely right on a large scale, but also the advantage of it being natural was that nothing was the same. So some veterans withstood it, others lost their tops, others lost limbs, others were scraped down the side of by other fallen trees. That opened up decay, rock pockets, wonderful habitat opportunities. And it's still there now. The impact of it, you can still see it today, to this day. I mean, I could take you to a woodland where there are still root plates, tree root plates, where they fell over, and the root plates are still over your head high. There's as much in the ground as there is up above the ground, and that's just the point where it's severed, obviously. But even now, 30 plus years later, those tombstones are still there. Albeit disappearing under the new life that happened. Bramble, scrub, old man's beard, wisteria, not clematis, I mean, sorry. Young silver birch, now probably about ready to fall over to make room for the oak trees that will also be in there. But we rushed out and planted. And I have been regretting that ever since, in some respects, that I didn't challenge it then as a young 17-year-old anarchic conservationist. I just went out and planted the trees like I was told to, without thinking about all the plastic that I was distributing around the countryside in the name of tree protection.
Yeah, that's true. So I'm assuming you were planting oaks?
There was a mix, yeah, oak. What else? We were on chalk here, in this part of the world, or clay and chalk anyway. And then you've only got to go a little bit further north. It's sandy. So planting types, species will depend on soil type. But yeah, oak, beech. Don't think much ash was planted, because that sort of planted itself quite well. Softwoods were planted too, but generally it was a hardwood mix of oak, beech, sometimes alder, not enough hornbeam. It's fairly boring mix, really.
Sure. So in retrospect, what about those decisions do you now feel that you would have done differently with the knowledge you have today?
Let a lot more of it to its own devices, whilst managing the predators either by persecution or protection. And the predators largely, funnily enough, are grazing deer and squirrels, all of which have been introduced by us.
Yeah, I didn't realize that squirrels were a nuisance species over there, that were an invasive until I.
Yeah, damn right they are.
It's so funny because they're so like ubiquitous here.
Yeah, well, you can have them back. Come and get them.
I don't want them back, but
they are bloody ubiquitous here as well. I mean, they're very much a commonplace scene in suburban parks and gardens. People are constantly fighting them off their bird feeders, because this country has a fetish for feeding birds instead of providing habitat. And they have caused untold damage to all the timber that was planted, but also a lot of natural regeneration too. And God bless the Victorians. I think it was 4 or 5 times they had to try to introduce them before they were successful. I don't quite understand what they were doing wrong.
Yeah, that's so funny.
Yes, they strip bark, ring bark. I mean, they create habitat opportunities, but from a commercial forestry perspective or a veteran tree manager's perspective, I don't want my 240-year-old maiden beech tree being ripped to pieces by some tree rat.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's so funny. So I've got to ask, because I think here, at least in the United States, we have a very skewed understanding of what forestry and forests and woodlands are in the UK. And from my perspective, I primarily envision it as like managed woodlands, meaning existing and previously managed coppicing fields and or coppicing forests and things like that. Is that accurate, or is it are there areas that are still kind of left to rewild, or whatever you want to call it?
Ooh. There are areas returning to wild. I've been directly firsthand involved with that myself, as to build on what we were talking about with natural regeneration. And you've got to start with the meaning of the word forest and the context of the nation and its interpretation of it. And forest here does not mean high wood continuous cover forestry with no glades or rides or access otherwise. The English, the British word forest comes from times when there was much more what we might describe as wildwood, and trees were probably harvested for falling over rather than positively cut down. And grazing was more extensive. There weren't the unnatural predators. And your forest in this country was a much more open landscape than even what most people consider to be a forest in this country. They'll go to a silvicultural situation, you know, a 4-story high larch or Sitka spruce or Norway or something like that, and call that a forest. But they won't actually appreciate the actual meaning of the word that they're using. So here, forestry is per se is quite intensive to be productive, and in this country, no piece of land has ever been untouched. There is nowhere here that we haven't been buggered up before. It's the nature of being on a relatively small island, and there are some areas, upland as well as lowland, that are now being given back to nature through what is being termed as rewilding, but it's still in the managed way that we will deliver our interpretation of it. And to actually get people to really seriously do nothing is very, very difficult. And it's not something apparently it is something I've got a problem with, but not when it comes to countryside management and habitat progression and reversing the damage that we've done most intensively in the last since the Industrial Revolution, really, until that point, and the invention of agrochemicals and intensification and the positive sides of productivity after the world wars that come around. You know, the countryside in the United Kingdom was doing fine, forestry was doing fine, but to actually get people to give up productive agricultural land is something that people really, really struggle with. And some great estates have done it, and on an estate scale, 1,400 hectare sort of size, they're putting a ring fence around the whole thing and rewilding their island.
That's an interesting idea.
But it works. It's the kind of there's grazers in there. There's cattle in there. There's control over the deer management, and in fact, there's red deer in there as well, which are the native UK species. And to actually have the funds, I suppose, to be able to do that, to walk away from sustainable farm, to walk away from productive agricultural land and let it go feral is not something that comes to the average British landowner very, very easily. And those are people that are connected with the land, not people that are misconstruing the conception of and perception of forest. So with rewilding, there's still very little actual letting go and seeing what happens. And to give you an example, with a project that I was involved with, where about 650 acres of productive farmland were turned over to, well, rewilding, if you like, wood pasture, coppice, woodland, naturally regenerated woodland, but also planted woodland. Out of that 600 and so acres, only 16 were fenced off completely from everything to see what happened. And if I took you there now, you wouldn't be able to see the back of this room for regeneration that's got away on its own. And yes, your oak trees are in there, but all sorts of other stuff as well. What did I see in there? Something obscure, like a monkey puzzle, which some joker must have taken all the way up there to stick in to see if we noticed. But yeah, even then, to a conservation organisation, letting go of 600 acres, putting a fence around it and walking away from it was something it struggled with. So partly because of needing public engagement for it, but also because it just doesn't feel right to people to actually say, let's do nothing and see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, we think about it from the perspective of, like, in our current ecological condition, there's so many invasives and concerns about creating the habitats for successful native species, and then you can mix in climate change into how native species are changing their native locations to try to survive climate change. There's a very weird understanding of what it means to, I guess, rewild the landscape or to try to bring it back to some kind of former state that is, in a lot of ways, arbitrary. Okay, what is the natural ecological condition of this site? Well, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, because those are going to be totally different.
Where are you going to put your finger? Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And if it's any of those, you'll be better off than 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Yeah, you're you're taking me somewhere I was trying to avoid going, but actually, yeah,
That's what I want to
well
do.
done. Here we go. Well, at the moment in this country, we are we've reintroduced white-tailed sea eagles, which we wiped out, and we are trying to reintroduce beavers, which keep dying, and also have got out. Which isn't what we want, because chaos might happen if we can't manage where we want the beavers. What happens when the beavers become a problem? What happens when they start? What happens when the white-tailed sea eagles become a perceived problem again? Because I haven't spent all my year trying to get 195% success out of one ewe, 2 lambs per ewe, so that I can watch that white-tailed so-and-so fly off with it. and that's why they were done for. And yet on the other hand, this links directly to where we started. We have done nothing about eradicating the grey squirrel. We are doing very little about effective deer management. We are doing nothing about the encroachment of bracken, very little about the encroachment of bracken onto heathland habitats, onto moorlands. We're doing lip service again. It's just, here we are banging in resources to put back stuff that we've already wiped out, and yet we're doing comparatively little about undoing the damage elsewhere that we've done by moving the stuff around.
Yeah, we so around my part in New England, Japanese knotweed is a huge issue.
Oh, yeah, that's
And
it here too.
yeah, and
Yeah.
so our town, we bring our waste to the dump, and I'm sure you know Japanese knotweed. You can't just throw it anywhere; it'll just grow.
No.
So I
Yeah.
asked them, I was like, where do you want me to put this? And the guy looked at me like, what do you mean? Where do I want you to put it? Put it with the compost. And I was like, that's a terrible idea. And like that just speaks to the fact that everyone might know about these like very popular like reintroductions, and we're not doing anything about these very grave problems that, and you could make the argument that it's Japanese knotweed is just taking advantage of a weak ecosystem, which is a whole other discussion to have. But it speaks to the fact that our priorities are on the sexy things, like getting new species or returning species, bringing back this time of ecological opulence or whatever it represents. This is kind of driving me in a different way that I want to talk, because I know you've got this really interesting background, and a lot of the listeners are a pretty good mix across the globe, but mostly American. And coppicing is like one of those things that's a big novelty here. If you get deep enough into the rabbit hole of ecology, you end up at coppicing at some point. But it's all online. You can't find somebody that does it really around here. I have a couple old willows that I've been coppicing, but that's like it's me hacking up a tree with a chainsaw and it just refuses to die.
That's coppicing.
Yeah, so I'm interested from your perspective about the role of coppicing and I guess humans in nature and what role that has in that rewilding of your local ecology, especially over there where there's that big historical context for it.
Having enough space to rewild properly is always going to be an issue, because if you wanted to do that, then you'd let stuff fall over of old age and coppice itself naturally. I think that's where it comes from. You often get rootstock regeneration when the top of the tree's gone. It's fallen over. Sometimes I think I've seen an oak that possibly blew over in Napoleon's time, and all the side dormant bud growth is now forming trees that themselves are quite respectful, but the whole thing is 20 meters long, where the tree was that size when it fell over all those years ago. And I guess we discovered our ability to do it when we were first slashing and burning. And it may also have been from a better observational relationship with our landscape that we just knew that that was the right thing to do. And that if you did it at the right time and to the right species, you could get different responses for different needs. And so we might coppice, again, it's all about productivity. We're going back to that commercial forestry again. It's just commercial forestry in a much more sustainable way that is more directly related to our personal needs, but also without taking too much out of the habitat or environment that we're in. And so coppicing is regeneration in that sense. And so as rewilding goes, it couples hand in hand with coppicing. But it also needs to fit in the wider stuff that sits more with the word forest because of, I've been thinking about this, because of the other aspect of UK woodland management, which is over and above coppicing, is wood pasture. And that's above grazing head height coppicing. It's just the same, but because it's up there and it's got a single stem before it goes.
Yeah, so you're talking about pollarding at that point.
It's pollarding, yeah. Exactly that, yes. And that gets you pastoral opportunity as well as a timber crop. And that's probably as important, if not more important, than coppicing. And if you put that into the forest context and the rewilding context, pollarding is just a tree's response to when it's been crowned. I mentioned that in the 87 storm, a lot of trees lost half the top. They're some of the most interesting trees in the woodland now, if they survive. So coppicing was, if you like, industrial intensification at its time to get the best out of the wood from a productivity sense. And we'd have been firing kilns on the stuff to start with. So if you get your single stem and you cut it and you get multiple stem regrowth, lots more surface area. So when your furnace is burning, there's much more heat going on because there's much more combustion going on because you've got a greater surface area in the kiln itself. And stuff like hornbeam or oak with its calories would be coppiced for that. Then your straighter, quicker growing stuff like hazel, which is your archetypal coppice plant. Stuff like hazel, silver birch maybe, would be used for, well, hazel in particular, thatching spars, pegs for holding reed thatched onto roofs, spokes for carts, ash, spokes for carts, axles for carts, wheels for carts, rims for carts, the rim of the iron hoop that went over the wheel of a wooden cartwheel's wheel. A wooden cartwheel would have been fired over a kiln full of over a furnace full of hornbeam or oak charcoal, but the very wood that's bent to make the frame of the wheel and used for the spokes and the axle would be flexible, tenacious ash. And so all aspects of the wood were important. And so getting the best productivity through coppicing or pollarding off of your land was the way to go at the time. And what role does it play now? Not enough. And stuff is generally coppiced at the moment to get it out of the way of the ash trees that the greedy so-and-sos are trying to get before it loses its value, to put it into a wood chip burning power station that wonderful United Kingdom's built to meet its climate change targets for 2020.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are way ahead of us in a lot of ways on that. So, I mean, I can't judge.
Yes, well, we've all got a part to play, and if that's what you're saying, then fine. Then if that's where we're taking a lead and it shows it can be done, then great. But I don't think it's doing woodland management in the United Kingdom a great deal of good. And if I suppose if it does, it will actually increase the value when we learn how to harvest it, not push it out of the way to get to the bigger single stemmed, more valuable stuff that goes through the chipper more easily. We will learn to harvest it. We will have to learn to use it. We'll be, hopefully, God please, we will be forced back into the woods.
Sure. No, and I agree. And that's the thing. Like, I feel like if you want to learn about coppicing, there's not a like or hedge laying or any of those skills that kind of come in that same territory. It's hard, especially over here, to learn anything. One of the things I actually want to ask you, and it's not even really a question like about your opinion, but I know there's like with coppicing, there's a technique of keeping like a mast tree. So if you want like one larger branch or shoot, and then still harvesting the smaller ones, I know there's a term for it, but I literally cannot find it when I look.
I have noticed that very often traditional coppicers will leave a stem or two per stool being the name for the pincushion regrowing stump. But I'm not aware of a word for that. I'll have to look that one up and get back to you. But it would make sense to encourage continuity of
It was something I
regeneration.
read, and it was like one sentence in like a long book, and I was like, huh, that's cool. And then like ever since then, I don't remember the book or like where it was, and I cannot find it. I've Googled it a million different ways. Like, it's gone.
I wonder, well, that's interesting because I have just, funnily enough, for the first time in probably 20 something years, laid a holly hedge, about 300, no, about 80 meters of it. It was an interesting experience, but I was looking for what I saw on everybody's shelves 30 years ago, the hedge laying handbook that we all used to take out to the woods with us to make sure we were getting it right. And because then I was learning. And I tried to get a copy of that book because my partner hadn't laid hedges and she knows her stuff in the countryside, but she didn't need to listen to me when there's a perfectly good book that tells her actually how it should be done, not the way I just about remember it from 25 years ago. But could I find a copy of that book? It's out of print. It's available online to read on a tablet, but that's no good when I've put this sledgehammer on top of it, when I've been knocking posting and forgotten that I've put the tablet down. So, and if I wanted to buy it, then I needed to probably spend over a week's worth of income for that out of print version. So, and there was also a handbook on coppicing, and it could have been in there. So I will have a look, because again, I imagine that I think there were more copies of the coppicing book, but there is it was a series of publications, and it might be where you saw this, published by the British Trust for Conservation Volunteers, BTCV, and it's now TCV, and Training Conservation Volunteers, and it's all online. But that would be probably the Bible of coppicing from when I was learning my agricultural skills in the woods all those years ago. And that might be where that technique was. Other than that, I do know a local woodman who's 83 this year, and he may well have the right story to answer that question.
Yeah, and that's one of those things. It's like if no one asks that question, that knowledge can be very quickly lost.
It goes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think when people hear like terms like ancestral knowledge, they have like these very vague, like spiritual understandings of what that means, but it literally is like passing things down from generation to generation, like these things that we've done as humans for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And within the span of 100, we've lost so much.
Yes, because we can now move about and leave it behind, and it doesn't matter. And that actually goes, we've lost connection to our landscape. And with that loss of connection to our landscape is any botherment around the knowledge required to understand it. And therein lies the fundamental hurdle for all of us in the first instance, is getting people back to where they should be, connected with the land, where they've come from, for goodness sake. It's not very long ago that people were traveling from turnpike to turnpike and were employed with their knowledge in this country, and were employed by them from another part of the world as well, even then. But they were employed for their knowledge of land management, where to put the ditches, where to put the gates, where to put the hedges, which one to lay, what needed coppicing, all of that stuff. And people they've lost it. And I'm lucky, because I seem to have been in it up to my nuts since I could, bunking off school at the age of something I won't admit to. But we're so fast. We're so quick to move on. We're so unconnected with what got us here. And it's all so important.
Yeah, and part of that is really like during the last couple hundred years, I think about like one of the things that's become really obvious since we started this project is that a lot of the way we live is directly tied to our food, which is directly tied to our local ecology. And as we've moved across the globe, like that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we haven't fused those things together, the new landscape with our traditional food systems and foodways. Instead, we're imprinting those foodways that we brought with us, or just kind of merging them with everyone else's foodways and losing the local component of it, or trying to stamp our idea of what local should be on it. And it just fundamentally doesn't work.
Yes, we've fragmented as well. If you want to go back to the habitats that we've created over the thousands of years in this country and around the world, most recently we've developed, cut them up and fragmented stuff, disconnected it all, so that stuff can't do the migrating you're talking about. It's going to need to do to accommodate climate change, the stuff that needs to move south, the stuff that needs to move north or east or west, because it's all changed in the last 30 years. And we've moved into places and applied our production values without really taking stock of the landscape, because we know we can. So if the pH is wrong, we can adjust it. If the NPK is down, we can chuck some of that in. We can make that out of oil, which can come out of the ground. That's great, isn't it? It's the loss of connection. Even dare I say it, I'll get slammed for this, but even some farmers, not all, but some farmers just have no connection other than the produce that they're making, because they've got a terrific sense of duty to feed the world, which is obese, apparently.
And that, a lot of those farmers, again, the food that they're growing isn't connected to the local ecology. It's connected to domestic or international markets.
The local ecology is destroyed to grow it.
Yeah. Instead of saying, okay, I've got this, forest that has, these various nuts that are, around here, for example, if you look at like traditional records of the colonists when they showed up, they would talk about the hickory nuts and all these other trees that drop, like walnuts and oaks and all these other, native trees, and how they were just everywhere. And then instead of saying, people live off of this food, we should try to integrate this into our diet, instead they're gone. And one of the things we see here, and I'd spoken to actually Alex Langlands about this, is that because of generational clearing of trees and things like that, the larger nut trees like hickories and walnuts and all the chestnuts, which have a whole other problem here.
Here too.
They've been pushed so far from, like, if there was a fire or a storm, like you had said, sure, they might have been wiped out of even a 10-mile space or even a 100-mile space. But now we're talking hundreds and hundreds of miles for those nuts to try to travel. And it's not possible. And then you mix in climate change and invasive species, and it's like these forests get trapped in this static succession of where they make no progress. And unfortunately for us, it's been primarily low productive forests. So it's primarily pines that don't have many nuts and things like that. So it's not even feeding the landscape. Is that something you guys are seeing a lot of, or?
I think the focus on timber harvesting at the moment certainly in this part of the world is is around. You mentioned sweet chestnut disease. We've got the ash tree, which interestingly did very well after the 1987 storm that I talked about earlier, because it's unlike the falling seeds that you're talking about that either need a vector like you and me to carry them around and drop them somewhere and forget we put them there, or a jay, for example, in the case of the oak tree and an acorn. But the ash tree's got windblown seeds, and it did very, very well after the 87 storm. And that is tending to me to be the main focus of everybody's activity at the moment, because I suppose that there's the greed thing. They've got to get the value out of it while it's still got the calories and it's not starting to rot. But also, if it starts falling over, there's the public health and safety side of stuff, but also the damage to the trees that you're talking about, such as the more valuable oak that might actually be getting somewhere now after the 1987 storm. And 35-year-old oak trees are starting to look quite respectable, but they won't be harvested for another, God, I hope at least 50 years, or even 100. But and there's building damage, health and safety, but also other crops will be damaged, I guess, perceivably by ash falling over, because there is that much self-sown ash in this country. The oak, the seed, the heavier. See, our sweet chestnut is native. I've got a pal who's proved it, and we will have moved that about a little bit. Other wildlife will have moved that out about a little bit. We've also planted it as a coppice, productive coppice plant anyway. So I don't see any natural, real processes that you're talking about being, there's generally it would be if there's some kind of the equivalent, I suppose, would be an oak woodland or a semi-natural woodland with oak and ash and beech and various hornbeam and willow and I could go on. But if that was Clearfeld, to go planting some kind of non-native softwood in this day and age, it'd be very, very disappointing. But we are suffering that kind of impact post-war, where we had no ground with trees on it because we knocked it all over for the war efforts, and we had to plant something quick and dirty, and not necessarily in the right places, because we didn't really know what we were doing, because we lost all that experience because a lot of them didn't come back. And that is part of the decline of the link that you talked about earlier, we talked about earlier with us and connectivity of the land, is that the wars, a lot of the land workers didn't come back, and all of the woodland went over to fuel the war, and then perhaps we didn't really know what we were doing with forestry after that for a wee while, and therefore planted all sorts of things to keep our options open, and in some cases those options failed because we planted them in the wrong place, because the knowledge hadn't come back from the war.
Sure.
I could see it in the holly hedge we were laying, where the first war had impacted. It had been planted in the mid-1800s, and if the hedge isn't maintained every year, it starts to get away. And if the girls don't come back after the first war, and it hasn't been maintained during it, it's the same with woodland. We Clearfeld a load of woodland, and so we're not in the same state of disconnect that you're talking about in that way. But what we are doing is disconnecting woodlands and fragmenting habitats in general, and not allowing stuff to move through corridors to get between the different habitats along with woodland.
Yeah,
we need corridors for wildlife between even the smallest isolated fragments of woodland.
Yeah, that's one of those things. I feel like it's so important, and it also is like something that I think gets a lot of support, the concept of it, because I think it's like as much of a novelty as it needs to be in order to get people to be like, oh yeah, that's a cool, interesting way to not make significant changes to the way we live, while also providing there's a large cost benefit for something like that versus alternatives to wildlife protection.
It's more proactive. It's less responsive. It's wherever we are in the world, we've overimposed ourselves on it. We take too big a part in it in a landscape scale for the natural world to cope with us. We are not designed like swifts to fly from Africa to the United Kingdom to breed for 3 months, feed off our insects and go back again. That's not what we're supposed to do. It doesn't change the fact that we've done it. It doesn't change the fact that swifts have declined 50% in the last, I think, 20 years in this country, or 50, what's the statistic? 50% in the last 20 years. And that there is something that's clearly being impacted by our impact on the landscape, our impact with development, our impact with the climate. And we don't know why. The only thing we are sure about is we're not providing for them in developments in the way that we should be.
Sure.
And that we've insulated them out of their breeding places that they've managed to keep up with us since they've had caves that we were dwelling in that they associate quite happily with us. And so we have to in a global way, we have to think about connectivity and what it is that is between here and Africa that's getting in their way, or what it is when they get to Africa that means that they can't come back along, because yes, obviously we're impacting them with the breeding, but there's others with the lack of breeding opportunities in this country because we're building them out by sealing up gaps and nooks and crannies. But what else is going on between here and there? And we really don't know yet. And so that connectivity on a global scale is much more important than we ever understand it. The nightjar, for example, another swift that flies here also from Africa to lay eggs, a couple of eggs on the ground. And it's got it's a really unique habitat requirement, and it uses this country to exercise it, and then it goes back. Well, that's much more important than reintroducing beavers when we don't really understand them anyway.
Yeah,
it's just. But so on a global, we really need to think bigger on a bigger global worldwide landscape scale about our imprint. I mean, it's all very well me talking about this, and then someone will have a pop back about world poverty and people need feeding. Well, the fact is, there's too many of us. It's just that
for the ecology
people,
that we've created, absolutely.
People. Sorry,
I said for the ecology we've created, absolutely.
Yes.
We are
exactly.
probably pushing the carrying capacity.
We've shoved it into corners and expanded into the vast expanses of landscape that they previously occupied.
Yeah, we put pavement over the richest soils in the world, and then we're surprised that food systems and ecological systems are starting to fall apart.
And we build in floodplains and wonder why they don't last very long.
So I've got to ask, two questions. So one thing I've been thinking about is around this idea of we're talking about getting humans back in nature. And one of the things we did an episode on the Japanese Satayama farms, or Satayama landscape, which if you're not familiar with is essentially a similar, coppicing type model around riverbeds and things like that.
Yes, I have seen that. Yes.
With the rice paddies and things like that. And what they've done in the last 30 or 40 years is try to do a big PR outreach into communities to get people out into the landscapes, to do those traditional practices and manage the landscapes, because all those unique species that could only survive after thousands of years couldn't survive when the landscapes were let go. They needed those unique conditions to survive. But what they found was while that species diversity slowed down shrinking, it didn't really stop. And what that kind of said to me when I was reading this was that I think that we need to have it's not about going through the motions. We actually have to have that connection to the landscape. Otherwise, it doesn't fully get the value for the ecology or us. And I was kind of curious about your thoughts about that.
We do need to find a way of getting people to understand the values that they still have that connect them with the landscape. And there are wood burners being fitted hand over fist, left, right, and centre in this country without people really realising that the cost of wood goes up at the same rate as the cost of gas and electricity, so it isn't any cheaper unless you grow your own. But they don't care where the wood comes from. They don't give the stuff if it's come from a garden centre in a polythene bag, produced in inverted commas sustainably in a woodland in Norway, only to see that it's silver birch, which grows here anyway. Why is that being shipped? We need to really the local thing, connecting people with local environments. You know, the whole firewood thing, taking wood from one part of the country to run a wood chip boiler on the other side doesn't make sense. Why aren't they growing it in Kent? Because the wood isn't there. It's as simple as that. It's got to come from everywhere else. And getting people sitting in front of the fire is like sitting on the beach, sitting by the river, going for a walk in the countryside, going for a walk in the woods, camping, a bit like a cave. All of those things are still in us, but because we don't have to split the wood and we can write a check for it, or we can turn the thermostat on the central heating, we've lost it. And I think with climate change and the climate agenda finally getting out where it needs to be, a little bit late, people are going to have to be helped to reconnect, to enable them to understand that they can't have the impact that we've had so far through the lifestyles they've led. You know, I'd love to see how much better the environment is statistically with gases and pollution with regard to the, in relation to the lack of air travel, in relation to the reduced fossil fuel car-based, lorry-based travel to do with all the lockdowns and the worldwide. Yeah, there was talk in the first early stages of COVID about the massive positive impact on the environment of it all. And then we very quickly refocused on the number of people that are dying. Well, how many people will be dying if that rate of environmental catastrophe continues?
Yeah.
It'll be a bit of a different statistic then, because it won't happen bit by bit as we give it to each other. It will happen en masse, catastrophically, because there's a horrid event, like a big sea wave, big wave, or a big wind, or a big heat, or a big cold, or a big wet. You know, that's what's going to do for us somewhere. We're already seeing it if we think about it.
Yeah, and like right now, as we're filming, Washington State, which I'm sure you don't know the local climate of it, but it's generally a coolish area that's like cool, tropical. It's very steady. Rarely, stays within about 50 degrees year round. Right now, it's 116 degrees. They're just getting pummeled, like smashing every record, not for the day, but ever. And not even like, oh, it's a degree warmer than it's ever been, like by like 10 degrees. It's just like totally unreal. That's something that people need to realize. This is the new normal. And even if we stop burning fuels today, it's going to take decades, a generation at least, to start to feel like things are stopping getting worse.
Yeah, it worries me that in my 50 years I've seen changes. It really, planting trees is easy until they start getting old, and 30 years they look like trees and you realise you've been around for a while. Having kids is another thing. Having kids is another thing because they get old with you and you don't really notice it. But climate change is fucking frightening, frankly.
Yeah.
Because I can see it. And I think when I was at school, we were supposed to be going into another glaciation. We were supposed to be going into another ice age period. That's what I was being taught.
I mean, technically we are, just we're offsetting it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But it's not even been mentioned, has it?
No.
I haven't heard that mentioned for 40 years.
Yeah, the only people that talk about it are the climate change deniers that say, well, scientists said 40 years ago that this was going to happen, and instead now it's heat instead. And it's like, well, if you spent more than 5 seconds reading what they said, you would understand that that's a bigger alarm. You're not making the point you're thinking.
I can't sit. That's my point. I cannot sit here and be a denier because I am of an age where I can see the changes. You know, the seasonality feels completely different. Wind direction is different at different times of the year, and yeah, it's worrying. But I'm, and then to look at it another way, I'm glad I am the age I am, because I might not make another 40 years to see the next 40 round of changes. What's it going to be like? Yeah, we've only got 10 years to make a difference to the next 30, is what we're being told at the moment. Well,
It's not looking good.
yeah, it's not. No, it's very, very frightening. And I know from, crikey, 15 years ago, when I was maybe 20, 25 years ago, I don't want to go into the coast stuff now, but when I was learning about climate change figures and the impact on sea level rise, never mind the impact of plate tectonic settling, but the impacts of sea level rise on the UK coastline were being talked about in maybe 6 to 9 millimeters a year. But that's because that's all we could actually perceivably accept. That was what was deemed to be a figure that might actually be believed. The real figures, I was being told, Mark, you don't want to know the real figures. I've just seen the latest prediction, and it knocks all that into a cocked hat. Never mind 9 millimeters. It could be twice that if this rate of expansion continues. And I'm talking 10 plus, 15 plus years ago, people, national advisors were telling me this kind of stuff. And they were too scared to tell us the truth. Oh, okay. So we'll let them feel the truth then. And now we are feeling the truth. And I can understand where the kids are coming from. I can understand where the kids are coming from, because it's quite apparent that we've done nothing about it till it's nearly too late. And now we're saying it's nearly too late. We need to do something about it. It could be my motto, but but not when it comes to climate and ecology. That's more important than me. I don't really figure how anybody can sit where they are and not notice what's going on around them at the moment. It's worrying, very worrying. Never mind bloody COVID.
Yeah. So you brought up, these kids. So I have to ask, do you, in your work, do you feel like you're seeing a lot of younger people getting interested in this kind of stuff? Not even like necessarily the climate change, but more of these like hands-on type experiential skills, we'll call them.
Getting back into the land.
Yeah.
Getting back in. Well, we've mechanized it all, haven't we? They are still there. There are still people that want to get their hands dirty. It's the product is still the woodland product is still undervalued for what it actually is, for the amount of effort that's put in to get it out. And so the wages for forest workers aren't great. And I mean, the thing we're communicating on is what dominates the youngsters' world these days, isn't it? So that's exacerbated by our own human nature and improvement and so on and so forth. But I don't see it. I don't see it at all. The agricultural colleges that were running conservation-based courses or countryside management-based courses or forestry-based courses, they're fewer and fewer decade by decade, if not year on year.
Yeah.
And 30-something years ago, I had a range of places I could choose to go to study. And 30 plus years ago, it involved getting my hands dirty. But now the emphasis is on academia and learning what you need to learn up there, but not about with your hands. And so people aren't in the woods learning like they used to. No, they're not. They're few and far between. And
sure,
I don't think many people in the agricultural or forestry industry would say that they would want their children to follow their footsteps. In fact, I know farmers that call themselves developers now.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks of fundamental problems in our economic system, that the things that make us human are no longer affordable to do, and that should give people pause about whether or not this works. This meaning like the way we've lived for the last X years. It's sobering.
It's a shame. There are people out there that want to do it, but we don't place enough emphasis on the need for environmental benefit out of the landscape and the habitats that we live and work in around. And I've got a very good friend who lives and breathes woodland and makes her own charcoal and sells that and makes some sort of subsistence from the charcoal. Also keeps herself going with, and her family with forest school leadership. She runs forest schools 5 days a week in local education establishments. She's connected, but she really struggles. She really struggles to make it pay, partly because of the scale of her ownership, but partly because people really don't want to pay the same for her charcoal as they'll pay for something that's come in a container ship across the Atlantic or the Baltic or wherever. It's they just don't. Well, surely it doesn't cost you as much as it does to put it on a container ship and bring it all the way over here. Well, why do you think they're bringing it here in the first place? They're not volunteering to give you charcoal, are they?
Yeah.
The stuff's there. It's growing in our woodland, waiting for someone to make charcoal out of it. The very hazel would have been used for charcoal. She's making lovely charcoal out of it. You go into a garden centre, you tell me how many garden centres are stocking, how many supermarkets are stopping UK-based charcoal. We shouldn't even be allowing it to be burning heavy oil to get across the sea to be put in our barbecues.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It's true. It's it's one of those things like, why does a McDonald's burger that is grown in, Brazil or wherever get packaged, shipped across the world and it costs $1, while, the local farm next door, that burger is like $6 and they're also still poor. It speaks of fundamental flaws in our entire economic system.
Yes.
This has been a fun conversation. Mark, do you have any, for folks that are interested, do you have someplace that you post work or a company or anything interesting that people might want to check out if they want to learn more?
Well, not yet. No, because I might have by now if I had a bit more confidence in this area. But I actually withdrew myself from Facebook activity at the start of the first lockdown because I felt that I might present something to the wider public that they might find unacceptable, and I might let myself down by saying something I regretted. Because one of the things that couples with what we're talking about is the selfish human natural behavior that we all seem to be struggling with at the moment on a worldwide scale. And I felt that if I was in the public domain, I'd want to have a pop at my fellow human race, because frankly, the way we're behaving towards each other and the planet is disgusting. I can't believe it. It doesn't make sense. Whose interest is this in? It's not going to do us any good, is it?
Yeah, that's true.
It just so unfortunately, no, I don't. I did start to put some stuff up, and I will have a bit of a thing, and when I do it, it'll be called Make It Wild, because that's what I'm about. But no, I don't have a presence like I should, and my 25-year-old son has had a little fiddle with it, and we need to do some more. But right now, it's not the most important thing I've got to do.
Sure. Well, if you change your mind,
let's see. I might be prompted by this chat, might I not? Let's see.
I don't know if you spend any time on Instagram, but in a lot of ways, it's a really fun way to see just people doing the work. Because I think for a lot of folks, especially like me, I can't go drive down the road and find somebody even within 50 miles that is doing stuff like coppicing and just like, trying to find somebody that can be like, hey, this is how you do it. This is what you're seeing here. That doesn't exist. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I personally would love to see some of that type of stuff. So that's my endorsement. And if you change your mind, let me know, and I will make sure to put a link at the bottom of the episode description.
All right, cool. Well, I'm under. My partner Charlotte, she's been very good, and she's posted some stuff on Facebook, and it's been followed, and it's got around a little bit. And you probably picked up the hedgelaying tag that she may have put on, and it is making me think it's probably about time I did start growing up and doing it.
There you go.
But it's just the technophobia in me. I'm a man of tools, not keyboards.
No, I hear you. When we started this podcast, I was like, wait, I have to do what now? I have to do what? Like, just let me be in the woods and like talk about stuff. Like, I don't want to do the tech part of it, but you figure it out.
Yeah, I guess if you prick my conscience, because I probably should, given what you just said. I am very lucky. I am very lucky. I'm very lucky to be able to have gainful employment outside in the environment, in the way I want, I suppose, to be able to go coppicing when I want to and say, yes, I'd love to lay that hedge and be paid for it. But I have to mix it up with all the other stuff because there's not enough around to make it sustainable. You could spend all day, every day on a chainsaw, head down, arse up, coppicing or felling or climbing trees and doing arboriculture. But I'm 50 for crying out loud. I haven't got that in me anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm catching up to you, so I know what you mean.
Yes. So doing a bit more of that on this kind of media might actually be something that makes up for the lack of hands-on impact. So yeah, I mean, I admire what you're doing, and I'm following.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you too.
As always, if you enjoyed this interview, please give us a review on iTunes and tell your friends. This is how we grow, and it's been really great to see how things have moved forward for us. Further, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook, where we post similar content, so go check us out over there. Until next time, this is Andy, and this is the Poor Proles Almanac.